A German shepherd stood alone in the snow, his eyes fixed on a door that hadn't opened in years. Around his neck, a worn collar, its metal tag etched with a face now lost to time. In the silence of a mountain town, he waited. Not for food, not for warmth, but for someone to remember. Have you ever seen loyalty so strong it defies even the grave? Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and tell us where are you watching from. Let's see how far Echo's story can reach. Snowpine Hollow lay buried under a soft white silence, as if the Colorado Rockies had drawn in a breath and forgotten to let it go. Winter was not a guest here. It was a long reigning monarch carving its will into frozen rivers and snow-capped rooftops. The sky had turned the color of steel hours ago, and the wind moved like a ghost through the pines, whistling secrets between the branches. In a farmhouse at the town's edge, Grace Walker stood wrapped in a woolen shawl, her breath fogging the frosted glass of the front window. She watched the snow fall in soft spirals, each flake drifting like a thought never spoken aloud. Grace had arrived in Snowpine just 6 weeks earlier after giving up her life in San Diego. She had been a trauma counselor for more than a decade, listening, absorbing, carrying the weight of grief that was not her own, until she forgot where her pain ended and others began. After her grandmother passed away, leaving the family farmhouse empty and silent, Grace had made the decision to leave the city behind. She was 33, tall and slender, with quiet posture and eyes that seemed to study everything. Her auburn hair, streaked naturally with copper, was usually tied back in a messy knot. She didn't wear much makeup and hadn't needed a reason to since she arrived here. The farmhouse had once been warm with music, cinnamon, and familiar laughter. Now it breathed memory-faded wallpaper, creaking floors, old photo frames, and drawers full of forgotten recipes. Grace had unpacked most of her belongings, but her boxes of books remained unopened. Something in her hadn't settled. Something still wandered. That evening, wrapped in flannel and holding a chipped ceramic mug of peppermint tea, she stepped out onto the porch. The snow came down in thick flakes, the kind that softened every sound and made even the wind feel muted. She looked out across the vast white yard toward the tree line that marked the edge of her land. Then she saw it. Movement. At first it was a shadow, low and deliberate, pushing through snowdrifts as if each step cost something. Grace squinted, setting her mug down. It wasn't a deer, nor a bear. No, the movement was too controlled. As it drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. A dog. A large one. He stepped into the glow of the porch light, like a figure stepping onto stage, a German shepherd, tall and gaunt, his ribs slightly visible beneath a thick coat, dulled by dirt and snow. His eyes striking amber pools locked onto hers unblinking. There was no collar, no wag of the tail. He stood at the base of the steps, shoulders tense, as if unsure whether she would offer food or raise a weapon. Grace didn't move. "Hey there," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the hush. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stared. She noticed a thin scar sliced through the fur on his left ear, a crooked tear almost surgical. His legs trembled slightly from cold or exhaustion, but there was still dignity in the way he held himself. She backed slowly into the house, leaving the door open, and returned moments later with a paper plate of leftover roast chicken and a bowl of warm water. She placed them on the porch just outside the steps and stepped back. "It's okay," she murmured. "I won't hurt you. You look like you've had a long road." He remained still for another full minute before edging forward, each paw pressing into the snow with practiced caution. When he reached the food, he sniffed once, then began to eat not with frantic hunger, but with swift efficiency. He never looked away from her for long. Every few bites, his eyes flicked up to make sure she hadn't moved. She watched in silence, taking in every detail. The slight limp in his back leg, the soot smudged on his right flank, the way his tail never curled but hung low. He had the bearing of a trained animal, a professional, not a stray. Something about him spoke of obedience, routine, memory. When he was done, he licked his muzzle and looked up at her. Not with affection, something more complicated. Recognition. Calculation. Then he turned and trotted away back into the dark mouth of the forest. Grace stood frozen for a long time after he disappeared. Something inside her stirred an ache she hadn't known was waiting. That dog hadn't stumbled onto her porch by chance. She felt it deep in her bones. That night she lay in bed under her grandmother's heavy patchwork quilt, but she couldn't sleep. The image of those amber eyes lingered behind her eyelids. She remembered how he had moved, how he had watched her. Like he knew more than a dog should know. Like he had chosen her. Around midnight, she rose and padded barefoot down the stairs. She retrieved a clean metal bowl from the pantry, filled it with kibble she had bought on a whim during a grocery trip weeks ago, and poured warm water beside it in a second dish. Then she stepped out into the snow, placed them neatly on the porch, and looked out into the woods. "You can come back," she said softly. "If you want." She left the porch light on, not because she expected anything, but because something in her heart had already made space. Inside the house sighed around her. The fire crackled gently. As she settled back into bed, she whispered not to herself, but to something she hoped could hear. "You're not alone out there." And for the first time since she arrived in Snowpine Hollow, Grace didn't feel entirely alone either. The next morning, the snow had slowed to a soft flurry, and pale sunlight filtered through the thin veil of clouds over Snowpine Hollow. Grace awoke to silence the kind so complete it rang in her ears. As she descended the stairs wrapped in a thick gray cardigan, she passed the front window and stopped. There on the porch, the dog had returned. He stood like a sentinel, his black and tan coat dusted with snow, but this time he was carrying something. Clutched carefully in his jaws was an old weather-worn leather collar, the kind meant for a large working dog. Grace opened the door slowly. He stepped forward and with measured grace placed the collar at her feet before backing up and sitting down with perfect posture. Grace bent to examine the collar. The leather was cracked and stiff, the edges curled slightly as if it had been lost in the elements for weeks. Affixed to it was a small metal tag dulled from age and weather, and a hidden pocket under the inner seam snapped shut. She unsnapped it, revealing a small laminated photograph, a man in his late 60s with sun-worn skin, a thick gray beard, and a veteran's cap kneeling beside a younger version of the same dog. They were both smiling. Attached to the collar was also a partial phone number, barely legible, with a local area code. No name. No full address. But enough. The German Shepherd watched her closely as she turned the collar over in her hands. "This is yours," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "Or his." She took the collar inside and laid it on the kitchen table beside her coffee. The dog followed her with quiet footsteps, tail low and respectful. He settled by the fireplace again, resting his chin on his paws. Grace couldn't ignore the feeling that this wasn't just any animal. This was a creature of memory and meaning. She decided he needed a name. Something that felt right. Something that spoke of echoes and returns. "Echo," she said aloud. His ears perked slightly. She tried again. Echo. The name settled around him like snow on pine branches. Grace smiled just a little. Later that morning, she drove into the center of town with the collar sealed in a plastic bag. Her destination was the general store, a modest structure with green shutters and a crooked wooden sign that read, "Holloway's Supply and Feed." The bell over the door jingled as she stepped in. Behind the counter stood Janice Holloway, a solid woman in her late 50s with broad shoulders, calloused hands, and salt and pepper hair pinned into a tight bun. She wore a denim apron and thick-rimmed glasses, and had the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had raised both children and livestock without ever missing a day of work. Janice looked up from the register. "Mornin', Grace. Road's all right, manageable. I was hoping you might recognize someone." Grace set the collar on the counter, then the photo. Janice leaned in, squinting. She let out a breath. Well, I'll be. That's Henry Callahan. You know him, course I do. Lives out past Birch Hollow along the old timber road. Or did. He used to bring that dog into town, same one you've got, I'm guessing. Named him Ranger, I think. Used to follow him around like a soldier on duty. What happened to him? Last winter there was a fire near his cabin. Forest Service came to evacuate, but Henry wouldn't leave. Stubborn old mule. Folks say he stayed behind. Haven't seen him since. Grace frowned. So no one checked on him. They tried. Road got buried after a blizzard. Then folks just stopped going. Everyone figured he moved away. Or... She didn't finish. Grace picked up the collar again, turning it slowly. What if he's still out there? Janice hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out a laminated map. You'll need chains. That road's hell in winter. She circled a spot. He's up this way. Used to have an old barn, 2-red roof if it hasn't collapsed. Thank you, Grace said. Janice gave her a look. You sure about this? It's 7 miles of snow and not a gas station in sight. Grace glanced down at Echo, who had waited patiently by the door the whole time. I think he brought me here for a reason. By the time she got home, the sky was beginning to darken again. She prepared her backpack, blankets, first aid kit, energy bars, flashlight, thermal gear. Echo watched from his place near the kitchen, his ears rotating with every zipper, every snap. When she clipped the collar to her coat for safekeeping, he stood up and stretched. You're coming right? She asked. He walked to the door and sat beside it. That night, Grace left a note on her kitchen table. It read, Gone to find someone who might have been forgotten. She placed it next to the framed photo of her grandmother and blew out the candle. Echo lay near her bed as she drifted off to sleep, the storm whispering against the windows and a strange sense of purpose curling around them like warmth from the hearth. Dawn came gray and reluctant. Snowpine Hollow was still buried in a deep hush, the kind that made footsteps sound louder and thoughts echo. Grace stood in the doorway of her farmhouse backpack, strapped tight thermal gloves tucked into her coat and her boots laced high against the rising snow. The wind had shifted overnight, and now it pressed cold fingers through every seam. She looked down at Echo, who stood beside her like a soldier awaiting orders. His coat, brushed and slightly fluffed from the warmth of the night before, shimmered faintly in the low light. Grace had wrapped a scarf loosely around his neck, both practical and a gesture of connection. Echo didn't flinch. The route to Henry Callahan's cabin wasn't listed on any GPS. Janice's hand-drawn map, creased and coffee-stained, was the only guide Grace had. According to the sketch, they would have to cross an old logging trail, pass a frozen creek, and ascend a short slope to the western ridge of Birch Hollow. 7 miles, Janice had said, but in this weather, it would feel like double. They started walking just after 7 a.m. The snow came up to Grace's knees in some spots, and she had to pause frequently to catch her breath. Echo trotted ahead, effortlessly, occasionally stopping to glance back and wait. His gait had changed. He moved with more certainty, his posture upright, as though the forest was speaking to him in ways Grace could not hear. Birds fluttered in the branches overhead, unseen, but present, and the distant creak of frozen trees filled the air like wooden sighs. By midday, they had passed the old creek bed, now a ribbon of ice beneath the snow. Grace paused to adjust her pack and drink from her thermos. They rested briefly under a crooked aspen, its white bark marked with initials of lovers from decades past. She noticed Echo pawing gently at the snow nearby. When she walked over, she saw he had uncovered a rusted metal sign half buried in the ground. It read, Callahan Trail. Private property. You remember, she murmured. Echo wagged his tail once in answer. They resumed their climb. The forest thickened. Evergreens leaned close, their boughs heavy with snow. Grace's muscles ached, but she pressed on, driven not by obligation, but by a strange mixture of duty and curiosity. Who was Henry Callahan? What kind of man left his home during a fire only for his dog to find a way back through blizzards and months of wilderness near the ridge? The snow turned powdery, and the trees thinned enough to allow a glimpse of the valley below. That's when Echo stopped, his body stiffened ears forward. He didn't growl. He simply stared ahead with such focus that Grace followed his gaze. Just beyond a clearing stood an old red-roofed cabin tucked into the tree line like a memory refusing to fade. It was weather-beaten but intact. Smoke did not rise from the chimney, but a stack of firewood rested against the wall. Grace could make out a path in the snow, partially shoveled uneven. But there. As they approached, Echo slowed, then trotted forward with growing urgency. He reached the porch and paused, lifting his nose. Then he barked once, short and sharp. The door opened. An elderly man stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy wool coat with a knit hat pulled low. His face was worn like old leather, creased deep at the eyes and mouth, but his posture remained straight despite the cane he leaned on. His eyes, a pale blue, scanned the tree line before falling on Echo. "Ranger!" the man croaked. Echo bounded forward but stopped just short of the steps. He sat tail sweeping the snow and whined softly. The man moved slowly down the porch steps, dropping to one knee with a stiffness born of both age and history. "My God," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You came back." Grace stayed back, heart tight in her chest. She didn't want to interrupt. The man Henry she now knew for certain wrapped his arms around Echo's neck, pulling him close. He didn't cry, not visibly, but Grace could see the dampness along his lashes as he rested his forehead on Echo's thick coat. "I thought I lost you." Echo leaned into him fully, nuzzling under his chin. Henry looked up. "You brought him?" Grace nodded. "Not exactly. I think he brought me." He slowly rose, gesturing toward the cabin. "You better come inside. It's cold as sin out here." The interior was sparse, but functional wood stove, small cot shelves lined with tins of soup and coffee. A framed photo sat on the mantel. It matched the one in the collar's hidden pouch. A younger Henry and a vibrant Echo posed beside an American flag. Grace noticed a prosthetic leg propped against the wall, worn, but cared for. Henry poured 2 mugs of tea, hand steady despite the cold. "Lost my left leg in Vietnam. Got by fine until a couple years ago. That's when I got Ranger Echo." "Now is it?" Grace smiled. "It suits him. He disappeared during the fire," Henry said softly. "I passed out from smoke. When I came to, he was gone. I figured the worst." Grace nodded. "He made it through snow and wilderness. And brought me your collar." Henry looked over at Echo, who lay curled by the stove. He always did have a compass in his chest. They sat in silence for a long while, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of understanding of reunion, of something larger than either of them could name. The warmth from the wood stove wrapped the room in a comfort that defied the frost outside. Henry sat in a faded armchair near the fire, one leg bent at the knee, and the other mechanical, resting stiffly in its brace. Echo lay stretched out by the hearth, occasionally lifting his head to watch his old companion with solemn, alert eyes. Grace stirred sugar into her tea, slowly unsure if she should speak. Henry was staring into the flames, lost in thought, his hand absently reaching out to scratch Echo's ear. The fire crackled between their silences. "I should have gone after him," Henry said suddenly, his voice low and rough like gravel. But the mountain had its own ideas that day. Grace set her mug down. "What happened exactly?" Henry leaned back and took a deep breath. His hands, battered and calloused, rested on the arms of the chair. It was early January. We'd been getting warnings about dry lightning for weeks. That morning I was outside repairing fence lines. Echo was with me like always, sniffing out the tree line, checking for movement. Always alert, always ahead of me by 10 steps. His eyes grew distant. The wind shifted. I didn't hear the lightning. I just saw the flash. Then the ridge caught, just exploded into flame. I didn't even have time to grab my pack. I turned to run back to the cabin, but a branch cracked behind me. Spooked Echo. He bolted. He ran, Grace asked, surprised. Henry shook his head slowly. He didn't run away. He ran toward something, down toward the gulch where the creek bends south. I figured he was circling back to get behind me, or maybe trying to find a safer path. He always did that scout out the next step, so I kept heading for the cabin, thinking I'd see him there. He paused to sip his tea, fingers trembling slightly from the memory more than the cold. But I never saw him again. By the time I got inside, smoke had already swallowed the windows. The power was gone, radio dead. I tried to go after him, but I slipped coming down the porch, twisted what's left of my good leg. Grace leaned and her brow furrowed. No one came. They did. Forest Service came through in choppers 3 days later. By then, the worst had passed. I told them about Echo, showed them pictures, gave them his scent gear. He gestured toward a half-burned nylon harness hanging on the wall. But nothing. No tracks, no sightings. Just trees. Ash silence. Echo raised his head then, as if remembering the same moment. His tail gave a slow thump. Henry chuckled bitterly. He must have been out there for weeks, maybe months, circling through old trails. That's the only way he could have found his way to you. That collar, I stashed it in the shed, pinned it behind a beam for safekeeping. If he brought that to you, it means he went back, dug it out, knew what it meant. He brought it straight to my door, Grace said softly. As if he wanted me to find you. Henry exhaled long through his nose. He always knew what to do when I didn't. Grace looked at the aging man, before her broad-shouldered, despite time-wiry strength still evident beneath layers of flannel and resolve. His beard was fuller than in the photo, peppered with more white, but his eyes were just as sharp. Beneath the stoicism, though, she saw the toll months without companionship, a winter of solitude deeper than the snow. Henry's cabin bore quiet proof of survival, reinforced windows, backup generators, shelves of non-perishables arranged in disciplined rows. But there was no clutter, no ornaments, no sign of joy. Just a worn Bible, a service medal in a cracked case, and a dog-eared photograph of Echo on the mantel. You lived up here all this time, she asked. Didn't have a reason to leave, he replied. Not till now. There was a pause before he added more quietly, I didn't think he was coming back. Grace's eyes softened. Sometimes it takes getting lost to come home the right way. A knock at the door startled them both. Echo leapt to his feet but didn't bark. His ears were alert, not alarmed. Henry limped toward the door and cracked it open. A woman stood there in a heavy brown coat, a thick knit hat pulled low, cheeks flushed from cold. Her name was Marla Jensen, a park ranger and the district's only winter patrol. She was in her early 40s, tall and sturdy, with copper skin and clear gray eyes. Her demeanor was firm, but fair, someone who handled emergencies without panic. She was holding a clipboard and a thermos. Henry Callahan, she asked, peering past him to spot Echo and Grace. You're alive. Henry blinked. Well, that's what I'm told. I've been checking the Ridge cabins monthly. Yours was the only one we didn't mark as vacated. I thought it collapsed in the fire. Held together, Henry said. By grit and frozen nails. She nodded toward Grace. Friend of yours? Grace introduced herself briefly, and Marla nodded with approval. Good. It's safer not to winter alone out here. We've had mountain lion sightings again near the old water line. She knelt to greet Echo, who stepped forward and sniffed her gloves politely. Well, she said with a smile, looks like someone's still doing his rounds. Henry leaned on the doorframe. He brought me back, in more ways than one. Marla handed Henry a printed notice. I'll log your cabin as active. We're starting supply drops next week. If you need anything, leave a red flag on your mailbox. Still got the old ham radio somewhere under the blankets. Try not to go another year without using it, she added with a wry grin. As she left, Grace watched Henry watch her go. Feels like the world kept moving, he said, and I just stayed still. Then it's time to start walking again, Grace said. They went back inside. Echo returned to his place by the fire, laying his head on Henry's boot. Grace made dinner from the supplies in her bag, beef stew from a thermal container, and Henry pulled out a tin of hard biscuits. That night, as wind whispered through the pine rafters, Grace felt the weight of a chapter closing and another beginning. Echo had not only survived, he had remembered. And in remembering, he had restored more than just a man. 3 days had passed since Echo and Henry were reunited, and the snow had finally stopped falling. The pines surrounding the cabin now stood heavy with frost, their branches bowed in still reverence. Inside the wood stove crackled constantly, and the rooms held the scent of pine smoke, old wool, and something that had not been in Henry's home for a long time company. Grace had stayed on sleeping in the loft above the main room where the floorboards creaked and the beams bore initials carved in another time. She wasn't sure what kept her there, concern, curiosity, or the way Echo would lie between them, as if he were the bridge for something long fractured. That morning, Grace wandered into the back room of the cabin, while Henry tended to the fire. The door had been stuck from lack of use, and when she finally pushed it open, dust scattered into the air like startled moths. The room was small, filled with forgotten items, an old snowshoe with a broken strap, stacks of faded mail, and a large cloth draped over something rectangular in the corner. She stepped closer, pulling the cover away. It was a piano, an upright. Its dark mahogany body dulled by time but intact. Her fingers impulsively found the keys. They were cold, slightly chipped, but when she pressed one, a low, imperfect note echoed through the room. Henry appeared in the doorway, one eyebrow raised. "You play?" he asked. Grace turned. "A little. My grandmother taught me on one like this." He walked in slowly, using the doorframe for support. "That belonged to my wife. Before she passed." There was a pause. Not awkward, just reverent. "She played every Sunday morning." Henry continued, his voice soft. "Used to say hymns sounded better when they didn't try too hard." What happened to her? Henry looked down. "Cancer. 5 years ago. That was the year I got Echo." Grace returned her gaze to the keys. "Do you mind?" Henry shook his head. "It'd be good to hear it again." She sat, testing a few notes. The sound was off, some strings out of tune, one key entirely dead, but the melody emerged slowly, something familiar and warm. A simple tune her grandmother used to hum while baking. Echo came padding into the room and lay down at her feet, ears tilted back, as if listening to a story remembered. Henry didn't speak, but his eyes glistened. The piano filled the cabin with something more powerful than speech. Graceful, broken, honest. Later over lunch, Henry asked, "What made you come here, really?" Grace paused, chewing slowly before answering. "I was tired, burned out. I used to be a trauma counselor in San Diego." Henry blinked. "Tough work." "Yeah, especially when you don't know how to leave it at the door. I'd sit with veterans, children, families, and carry them home with me. Eventually, I couldn't tell whose pain I was holding anymore." He nodded, understanding flickering behind his eyes. "That kind of weight'll take your knees out from under you." She looked at him. "When I found Echo, it wasn't just about helping a dog. It was like, he found me too." That afternoon, they worked together to clear the path to Henry's woodpile. Grace shoveled while Henry hauled lighter logs, with Echo trailing behind, occasionally stopping to dig curious sniffs into the snow. They settled into a rhythm, not rushed, not strained. Just movement between people who had once stopped moving. In the evening, Marla returned. The ranger brought supplies, basic medicine, a new weather tarp, and several thermal blankets. She also brought news. Sheriff said they're holding a gathering at the community center next weekend. First winter potluck since the fire season ended. They're inviting everyone in the outer cabins. Thought you might want to come. Henry grimaced. "Can't say I'm much for potlucks." "You don't have to bring food," Marla said with a grin. "Just bring yourself," Grace added. "You could bring Echo. I'm sure they'd love to see him." Marla glanced at the piano, then at Grace. "Didn't know you played." "My grandmother taught me," Grace replied. Funny, Marla said your name came up in town yesterday. Someone saw your truck and asked if you were related to Agnes Walker. Grace blinked. That was my grandmother. Marla smiled. She used to play at every town service. Folks still talk about her music like it could change the weather. The connection landed in Grace's chest like a pebble in a still pond, subtle but spreading. After Marla left, Grace lingered near the piano. She played again softly this time, something slow and wistful. Henry sat nearby, one hand on Echo's back, eyes closed. The cabin no longer felt like a place frozen in loss. It had begun to breathe again. By late February, the snow around Snowpine Hollow had begun to loosen its grip. The sun stayed longer each day, filtering through the tall pines in slanted golden shafts. Icicles thinned, dripping rhythmically from rooftops, like nature's own metronome. Though patches of white still clung to the shadows, the forest had started to stir. Coyotes howled more often at dusk, birds returned to their old songs, and tiny buds formed like promises on bare branches. Grace stood outside Henry's cabin, her breath rising in faint puffs as she adjusted her scarf. She looked toward Echo, who was sniffing near the edge of the trail that curved beyond the barn. The old red-roofed structure, though weathered, had survived the fire with surprising resilience. Henry had spent the last 2 days clearing debris from its interior, muttering that it smelled like soot and ghosts, but was worth salvaging. Today they planned to follow the ridge trail behind the barn, a trail Echo had sniffed at repeatedly for the past week. He seemed restless, as if some unfinished business still pulled at his instincts. Henry stepped out onto the porch jacket, zipped cane in one hand. "You ready to humor that dog of yours?" Grace smiled. He hasn't let it go. Can't argue with a hound's nose. They set off slowly, Grace leading while Henry took measured steps behind her. Echo ranged ahead, ears twitching tail level. The path wound uphill, framed by charred tree stumps and saplings trying to rise again. Grace glanced back once and noticed something remarkable: the way Henry's shoulders had straightened, the way he seemed more in step with the world. After about 40 minutes, Echo stopped. He stood completely still near a fallen log, pawing at something half buried beneath the earth. Grace crouched beside him, brushing away the snow and leaves. It was a canvas satchel, old-faded, the leather straps stiff. She opened it carefully. Inside were a rusted thermos, a folded map, and a photograph. The picture was weather-worn, but visible. Henry, younger by at least 20 years, stood beside a different German shepherd. This dog was broader fur, darker, but the eyes were unmistakably similar to Echo's sharp, intelligent, devoted. As Grace lifted the satchel, something else tumbled out: a worn woolen scarf, partially frozen, but unmistakably human. She picked it up gently. It was gray-blue with frayed edges and faint reddish threads woven into the pattern. Henry knelt beside her and blinked. "That's mine. My wife knitted it for me back in '78. I wore it every winter until after the fire. I thought it burned with the shed." Echo nudged the scarf with his nose and gave a quiet whine. Grace looked at him, a realization dawning. He must have found it after the fire. Buried it here. Maybe he thought you'd come back for it. Henry took the scarf with trembling fingers, bringing it slowly to his face. He didn't say a word, but Grace saw it, the way his shoulders rose with the weight of memory, then slowly lowered, as if something long locked away had just been allowed to exhale. They sat together for a while at the base of the log. Above them the trees swayed with a new breeze, the first breath of spring. As they walked back, Echo trotted alongside Henry, occasionally brushing against his leg. The silence between man and dog was easy now, filled not with loss, but understanding. Grace lagged a few steps behind, feeling something shift, like Echo had led them not just to this spot, but into something deeper than memory. Back at the cabin, they cleaned the satchel and placed the photo beside the one of Echo and Henry on the mantel. The two dogs, decades apart, now stared out side by side. That evening, Grace played the piano again. This time she played a military march, turned soft ballad, and Henry sang a few lines beneath his breath, barely audible but clear. Later that night, Grace stepped outside to breathe in the warming air. That's when she saw a small figure approaching from the ridge trail. It was a young man, tall, gangly, maybe 19 or 20. He wore a patched jacket, torn gloves, and carried a canvas pack slung over one shoulder. His hair was dark and tangled, his cheeks red from cold, and his boots were caked in frozen mud. Grace stepped forward cautiously. "Can I help you?" The boy paused, visibly startled, but didn't flee. His voice was rough, unused. "I saw smoke. Thought maybe someone lived here." Behind her, the door creaked open. Henry stepped out, Echo close behind. Grace nodded. "We do." The boy swallowed, eyes darting. "Name's Eli. I've been walking since Idaho. Just needed to get warm." Grace studied him. He looked exhausted, but not threatening, more scared than anything. His frame was thin, like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Henry glanced at Echo, who remained calm. That was all the confirmation he needed. "Come inside," Henry said. "You can rest a while." Eli hesitated, then stepped forward slowly. Grace prepared soup and offered him dry socks. As he ate, he explained in fragments his father had passed 2 winters ago, his mother had remarried and moved south. He didn't fit there, had nowhere to stay. He'd been hitchhiking, sleeping under bridges, doing odd jobs for food. Henry leaned forward. "What brought you up here?" Eli looked down at Echo, who had settled beside him. "I don't know. I followed paw prints." They all fell quiet. That night, the cabin felt fuller than ever. Grace lay awake in the loft, listening to the wind. Echo paced downstairs, checking each room before settling near the hearth. Somewhere between the silence and the sigh of the pines, Grace felt something gentle and true. Like healing was no longer a distant possibility, but already happening. Snowpine Hollow in early March was a place between worlds. The snow still blanketed the valley like a fading memory, but each day brought the scent of thawing earth and the quiet return of color. Buds pushed through frost, the creek murmured louder under melting ice, and Echo, always alert, seemed to listen more carefully to the shift in the wind. Inside the cabin, things were shifting too. Eli had stayed. What was first a night to escape the cold turned into days of helping with firewood, fixing the sagging barn door, and slowly learning how to speak without fear. Henry, though initially hesitant, had grown to like the boy's quiet presence. He reminded Henry of someone he once knew, a younger version of himself, maybe before time and loss made him wary. Eli was lanky and often hunched, like he was trying to shrink into himself. His hair remained unruly and his clothes still mismatched, but his eyes had softened. He laughed more easily now, especially when Echo trotted into the cabin with a pine cone in his mouth like a proud hunter. Grace noticed the subtle change in Eli's posture each time he looked at Echo, not just comfort, but reverence. One afternoon, Henry called them all to the barn. He had cleared out the center and was standing beside an old carpenter's bench, now dusted off and covered with folded canvas. "I've been thinking," he said, gesturing at a weathered wooden sign in his hands. "It's time this place had a name again." The sign read, "The Echo Haven." Grace blinked. "It's beautiful." Eli stepped forward. "You're naming it after the dog?" Henry nodded. "He brought us back here. All of us. This land, this cabin, it was hollowed out after the fire. But Echo filled it again." Grace smiled gently. "He didn't just bring us here. He made us stay." Echo barked once, almost like approval. That week, the 3 of them worked together to build a new fence around the property and repaired the back shed into a supply room. Grace cleared a spot in the meadow for a garden. Eli began carving wooden paw prints onto the beams of the porch, and at night the fireplace crackled with shared stories, not all of them finished, but each one trying. One morning a letter arrived. It had been forwarded through several ranger stations and bore the emblem of a Veterans Registry office. Henry opened it slowly. It was a commendation decades late for his service with the Search and Rescue Division in the Rockies. Attached was a note from a retired officer. "We never forgot your work with Rex. Stories of your team still circulate in the academy. We're glad to hear you're safe." Grace looked at the photograph they'd placed on the mantel, the old photo of Henry and Rex. Now beside it, she added another echo sitting tall beside Eli and Henry, all three of them looking into the woods. Word about the shelter began to spread. A ranger named Kyle, broad-shouldered with a freckled face and a kind demeanor, came by after hearing stories of a mountain dog who rescued a hiker weeks ago. He offered to bring supplies from the nearby ranger station and asked if Echo might one day assist in local wilderness searches. "Animals like him," Kyle said, scratching Echo's ears, "they don't just guide people. They remind them they're not alone." The story reached the local newspaper. A short column ran under the headline, "Dog that survived fire leads others home." It featured Echo's face, Henry's restored barn, and a quote from Grace. "Some scars don't fade, but neither does loyalty." Visitors started coming. Quiet ones. A woman who had lost her husband and wanted to walk the same trail Echo once took. A teenager with a stutter who felt calmer around dogs. A man with PTSD who simply wanted to sit by the fire. They didn't call it therapy, but it was. One evening, Grace hosted a small gathering in the barn, now cleaned and strung with soft lights. They called it a night of voices. People took turns sharing poems, memories, even just silence. At the end, Eli stood and held up a carving. It was a wooden medallion with Echo's likeness etched into it, ears perked, eyes gentle. Below was the word, "Returner." Henry stood, slowly walked over, and placed the carving above the fireplace mantel. "He's not just a survivor," Henry said. "He brings people back to themselves." The room was silent. Outside, Echo sat at the edge of the porch, watching the stars blink into life. His ears flicked back at the sounds of warmth behind him. His body was still, but his presence pulsed with meaning. In the hearts of those who now called the mountain home, Echo wasn't just a dog. He had become something else, a living symbol. Of resilience, of loyalty, of quiet redemption. And though he never spoke, everyone heard what he was saying. "Come back. It's not too late." The sun crested over the mountains like a long-awaited promise, melting the last vestiges of winter from the high ridges of Snowpine Hollow. A golden light swept across the land, casting long shadows from the trees and bathing the earth in warmth that felt almost sacred. It had been months since Grace first found Echo by her doorstep, and the rhythm of life had changed slower, deeper, richer. Today was a day for beginnings. The Echo Haven had officially opened its doors to the public, not as a formal clinic or retreat, but as a sanctuary for healing. There would be no forms to sign, no fees to pay, only the quiet understanding that to come here was to seek something lost. Hope, peace, or perhaps a version of oneself long buried under sorrow. Grace stood outside the barn, now converted into a sunlit welcome hall. Her auburn hair was pinned up loosely, wisps escaping to dance in the breeze. She wore a linen shirt tucked into faded jeans and had a bandage on her left hand from a recent splinter. Her eyes scanned the clearing with quiet anticipation. Henry sat on the porch steps beside Echo, who rested calmly at his side. The old man looked different now, more open, less coiled. He wore his navy flannel shirt, a clean shave on his chin, and a freshly polished pin on his collar, the insignia of the rescue unit he once served in. He ran his fingers through Echo's fur, absent-mindedly, like one might a memory. The first guests arrived just before noon. A single mother from Montana with a young girl who hadn't spoken since her father's passing. An older man who limped from an injury and carried a journal of poems he never shared. A woman whose arms were covered in faint scars who asked nothing and said little but sat for hours beside Echo as if she had known him in another life. Eli took the role of quiet guide. Now sturdier in demeanor and voice, he showed people around the meadow, the trails the creek bend Echo used to frequent. He had even started training with Kyle the ranger, learning basics in tracking and search assistance, hoping one day to partner with Echo officially. At the edge of the clearing, a white tent had been raised, simple canvas adorned only with a single carved sign above its entrance: Return to Light. Grace had chosen it as a space for rest and prayer, or simply silence. Inside, a small wooden bench sat beside a wall of hanging cloth squares, each embroidered with a name, a wish, or a memory. Grace found Henry standing inside the tent in the afternoon, his fingers brushing one of the cloths. It had Rex's name stitched in blue thread beside a tiny paw print. "I never said goodbye to him," Henry whispered. "Not properly." Grace placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe today's not about goodbye. Maybe it's about carrying him forward." Echo appeared in the tent's entrance, then carrying something in his mouth, a faded green bandana, weather-worn and slightly torn. He laid it at Henry's feet. "That was Rex's," Henry said, kneeling slowly. "I thought it burned." Grace knelt beside him. "He kept it all this time." They didn't speak for a while. Words felt too small. As evening neared, the community gathered outside the barn for the first Echo Walk. It was a quiet tradition. Grace and Eli had created a path lit with small lanterns along the forest edge, meant to symbolize letting go and walking toward healing. Each guest held a candle and walked at their own pace. Echo led them. No leash, no command. Just a steady presence guiding them down the trail. At the end of the path stood a large oak tree, its bark scarred by lightning years ago, but still alive, still strong. A plaque had been placed there earlier that day. It read, "To those who wandered and found their way back, led by loyalty, healed by love." After the last guest departed, the three remained, Grace, Henry, and Eli, watching Echo sit beneath the tree. The stars began to emerge overhead, one by one. "I used to think survival was enough," Henry said. "But it isn't. It's what we do after that counts." Eli added quietly, "He survived. Then he brought us all here." Grace smiled. "And now we carry it forward." Echo stood and walked back toward them, slow and steady. As he reached the porch once more, he paused and looked back at the trail. A breeze passed through the hollow, then light and full of promise. Maybe he saw something. Maybe he simply remembered. Either way, Echo knew his final trail was never about finding a place. It was about leading others home. Sometimes the ones who heal us don't speak. They wait, they listen, they stay. Echo reminded us that loyalty can outlast storms, and even silence holds meaning when it's filled with love. In our busy lives, we often forget the quiet ones walking beside us, be it a pet, a friend, or even a stranger with kind eyes. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below, subscribe for more true stories of love and redemption, and tell us who was your Echo in life.